arguably the most important environmental issue in animal agriculture these days in California and in many other parts of the world are greenhouse gases, and in particular, one greenhouse gas, which is methane. I believe that methane is the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, the greatest vulnerability of animal agriculture today. You will find throughout my talk, which is largely centered around methane and how livestock affects climate and how these impacts can be reduced, that it is not as easy as you might have thought how this gas affects the climate. So some of you in the audience might not know much about greenhouse gases and climate. Some of you might be experts, but let me just start by what greenhouse gases do and why we care about them. What you see on this slide is the sun radiating down solar beams to the surface of the Earth. And normally that solar radiation and the associated heat would be reflected back into space if there weren't a blanket of greenhouse gases. Just imagine a blanket that you put over your body, and when you do, it retains your body heat close to your body, and it keeps you warm. So these gases, these so-called greenhouse gases, form this blanket over our atmosphere, preventing the solar radiation from all going back into space. And with that, some of the heat from the solar radiation is retained in our atmosphere. On this slide here, you see different greenhouse gases. Some of them are carbon dioxide, that's the number one, the most abundant greenhouse gas. You see methane, you also see nitrous oxide. These are the three main ones that you see discussed day in, day out. Carbon dioxide is largely the result of burning oil, coal, and gas, the so-called fossil fuels. And it's arguably the number one greenhouse gas, leading to the greatest effect of human activity on climate. Methane is largely released through agricultural activity and things such as landfills. It is produced in smaller amounts than CO2, but it is a potent greenhouse gas. It's more powerful per molecule than CO2. This slide here is a little complex, but what it shows is all sectors of global society and how they contribute to greenhouse gases. What you see on this slide in red is that the majority of sectors affecting or producing greenhouse gases are associated with energy. And energy means nothing other than fossil fuels. So all these sectors burning oil, coal, and gas, like transportation, industry, and so on, are depicted here in red. As you can see globally, they make up about 3/4 of all greenhouse gases. And what you also see on this slide is that agriculture is not unimportant. It is also a source of greenhouse gases, and this is why I'm here today. Because I'm here today to talk about those greenhouse gases coming from animal agriculture. So globally, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that all of animal agriculture globally makes up 12% of all greenhouse gases. The same organization, the FAO in Rome, originally said that livestock contributes to 18%, 1/8, but that has over the years been reduced because of advances in science and more precise modeling. Just think of countries like Ethiopia or Somalia or other very rural countries. In these countries, livestock might make up 50% or more of all greenhouse gases in those respective countries. And so the media oftentimes takes this 12% global number and says, livestock emits 12% of all greenhouse gases, and because of that, we now need to change something we do here. But if you want local action, then you need to have local data. The next slide I show you is a slide from the United States. It comes from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is the emission inventory for the United States. What you see there in this salmon color are all the sectors that burn fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. So that's transportation, industry, and so on. And as you can see, that's the lion's share of greenhouse gas emission. So on the x-axis you see the years, and on the y-axis you see carbon emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions cumulative. So this here is the fossil fuel sector, and then down here in orange you see the total contribution of the beef sector, and in light blue you see the total contribution of other livestock sectors. And if you add them all together in the United States today, the EPA says that 4% of all greenhouse gases in the United States stem from livestock. I'm pretty sure the numbers are similar here in the Czech Republic. They are similar in most European countries. This is not to say that we should not worry about this because we are a relatively small part of the total picture. It's not to say that. It's just to give you a relative idea of what the contribution of animal agriculture is. So when we talk about these different greenhouse gases, I already told you that methane is more powerful in trapping heat from the sun, and nitrous oxide even more so. So just think about, if you have a glass of, say, beer, versus a glass of wine, versus a glass of vodka, and you drink all of them, one of them gets you drunk faster, right? In the case of alcohol, potency of getting you drunk. So, the same is true for these greenhouse gases. One molecule of methane is almost 30 times more powerful in trapping heat from the sun than one molecule of CO2. And one molecule of nitrous oxide is 265 times more powerful than one molecule of CO2. The way of comparing these gases to one another, the way that I'm projecting here on the screen, is 30 years old. It's called GWP 100, global warming potential, over a period of 100 years. But the picture is actually much more difficult. And this unit, this GWP 100, has become criticized, has been criticized over the recent years. Why? Because every time we burn oil, coal, and gas, we put CO2 into the atmosphere day after day after day after day. And the CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, becomes more and more and more and more, and that causes more and more and more and more warming. And the same is true for nitrous oxide. This very powerful greenhouse gas is produced by certain processes, and it accumulates. It becomes more and more and more and more over time, leading to increasing rates of warming. Both CO2 and nitrous oxide are considered long-lived climate pollutants. But today we talk about methane, because methane is the big deal for animal agriculture. But what's different between methane and the other gases is that methane does not only have sources, but methane also has sinks. So you see here one large arrow pointing down, and it says sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And then you also see sink from soils. If you add these two up, you arrive at total sinks amounting to 548, let's call it 550. The world media always talks about the sources, but they do not consider this issue, that there are sinks, and they should, Because if you want to know what the net contribution is globally, you need to subtract the sinks from the sources, and then you arrive at the difference, which is depicted here in red, 10. A number still high and too high, and we want to further reduce that, but a number that's very different than 560. So this GWP 100 that simply says methane is 28 times more powerful than CO2 does not account for this atmospheric removal in an appropriate way. And because it doesn't account for this in an appropriate way, GWP 100, what I just showed you, is now known to overblow the impact of constant methane sources on warming by a factor of 3 to 4. So what's happening to methane? Why is that being removed? Why is there an atmospheric removal? What does this mean, sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere? If a methane molecule is in the atmosphere, and once it's in the atmosphere, it takes about 1 decade, 10, 12 years, for this methane molecule to meet another molecule called a radical. It's called a hydroxyl radical. And that hydroxyl radical kills the methane. And that takes about 10, 12 years. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. So as a take-home message from this slide, please remember methane is not just produced by sources, but methane is also destroyed by sinks. And to have good accounting, you need to subtract the one from the other. So why is that so important? Because it affects the lifespan of this gas. And you see that here. Carbon dioxide has a half-life of 1,000 years, meaning if you drive your car someplace, you put CO2 out through the tailpipe, and that CO2 will stay in the air for 1,000 years. So if you drove a car 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that CO2 is still there. And in addition to the new gas that you put into the atmosphere, this, ladies and gentlemen, is why CO2 builds up. It goes up, 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 and up. Nitrous oxide, the other long-lived climate pollutant, also stays in the air for a long time. And I already told you that's more potent, much more potent. It stays in the air for over 100 years. That methane, of course, contains carbon. And that carbon comes from atmospheric CO2. Everybody might remember from high school that plants, during photosynthesis, take CO2 out of the air and they give off oxygen, right? And those plants produce carbohydrates. So photosynthesis is plants taking CO2 out of the air, producing oxygen, putting it into the air, and building carbohydrates. These carbohydrates could be starch, or these carbohydrates could be cellulose. And cellulose is the world's most abundant biomass. Nothing in the world is more abundant as cellulose. The only animals that can digest this cellulose and make something from it that we can eat are ruminant animals. I will come back to that. So plants take CO2 out of the air, they make it into carbohydrates, which are, some of them are in the above ground vegetation, a lot goes also in the below ground vegetation. And then our cow eats that vegetation. She eats that cellulose, for example, in grasses and other feedstuff, and in her rumen, in this large part of her digestive system, microbes break down the cellulose, and it's only those microbes that can. And when they break down the cellulose, They produce volatile fatty acids. Eventually they become meat and milk. But an unintended consequence of being able to break down the cellulose, an unintended consequence of breaking down this cellulose is that these microbes produce methane. Just like we all produce CO2 right now, these microbes produce methane. And that methane has to come out, and it does come out when the cow belches. So overall, it's a beautiful thing. You have CO2 in the air, you need sunshine, the plants can convert all of that into plant material, and the animals can actually digest that, but the unintended consequence is methane production. While this methane is in the atmosphere, it's a potent greenhouse gas. But is the carbon in this methane new carbon added to the atmosphere? I ask you. Is this carbon in the methane, the C and the CH4, is this new carbon, new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere? It is not new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere. It was in the atmosphere before in the form of CO2, but now it has changed its form. It's another form of carbon in the atmosphere. And after about 10 to 12 years, it will go back to where it came from, CO2. And so the cycle closes. You have atmospheric CO2, which makes it into plant carbohydrates, which makes it into methane, and that makes it back into CO2. For those of you who are farmers in the audience, I encourage you to not interpret this as meaning, oh, it's cyclical, it's natural, so we don't have to worry. But I do want to tell you, this carbon is not new to the atmosphere, it's a different form. I also want to tell you, you might wonder, well, this is only short-lived, this is long-lived, so is this actually a bad thing? This slide here contrasts both, the fossil carbon on the left side, the biogenic carbon on the right side. We start on the left side. This is what I just explained. There's fossil carbon that was in the ground for a long time. We extracted it, we burned it, and now it's in the atmosphere, and that's where it accumulates. The biogenic carbon cycle I talked about earlier is where atmospheric CO2 from the atmosphere makes it into plants during photosynthesis. Some of that carbon that came from the atmosphere and that makes it into the above ground vegetation is eaten by cows. In the rumen, some methane is formed and belched out. That methane is converted back into CO2. So you have this biogenic carbon cycle on the right side. You have the one-way street of carbon on the left side. Who would say these are the same? In the one case, you always have new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere. On the other side, you have carbon cycling around. I want to be very clear about this. I'm not de-emphasizing the importance of biogenic methane, but I'm saying there's a lot more nuance to it than just saying methane is 28 times more powerful than CO2. Cows are pretty much the same as cars. That is not true. What you see on this slide is the California dairy. What used to be an open lagoon where the manure was stored, right here, is now covered. And therefore it's called a covered lagoon, or also an anaerobic digester. So the gases that normally are produced in this manure lagoon are now trapped. And what you see bulging out here is this so-called biogas. This biogas is 60% methane. It's converted into a fuel type for vehicles. And then this biogas that's converted into vehicle fuel is going into heavy-duty trucks and buses. This dairy renewable natural gas is going into these trucks, replacing diesel. In addition to manure technologies and approaches, there are also feeding approaches. This here is a list of feed additives that you add to the diet of a cow to reduce enteric methane. There are also approaches like putting a capsule, a so-called bolus, into the rumen of animals in order to slowly reduce methane over the course of a half a year or so. A very important approach is breeding. A very important approach is feeding. A very important approach might be feed additives. Some of those are listed in this review here. If you want to read up on it, I urge you to read this paper.